Both Derek and Karen stood frozen in shock, unable to act in time to help. As Rodion plummeted, he screamed desperately for a status window, as if he were still inside a game. When he came to, he found himself lying on the ground, wondering whether he had died, and was now seeing the afterlife. He tried moving his body to check for injuries, but found himself completely unharmed. He figured that his last-moment prayer must have been answered. But oddly, he hadn't felt any kind of power awaken inside him to cushion his fall. As he began to examine his surroundings, nothing matched the information he knew from the story, no matter how much he explored. He noticed that the area around him was a perfect barrier composed of otherworldly mana, something tied to the outer realm according to the setting, as though the entire place had been constructed by magic. He was startled by a voice above him, saying he had finally awakened. He turned quickly to see who was speaking, and was met with the sight of a massive creature, an eye surrounded by extending tendrils. The appearance of the being was beyond comprehension, and Rodion fainted on the spot. When he came to, he immediately apologized for his reaction, saying it was due to the creature's strange and unfamiliar form. The being responded that he would be forgiven. After all, Rodion was the first human it had seen in 1,000 years. It added that it had believed only godlike entities had the power to reach this place and never expected the day to come when that changed. It moved closer to him in a way that revealed its admiration, though Rodion found it oddly talkative for something without a mouth. When he asked about the nature of the place they were in, the being explained that it was the location where it had been sealed, a relic created 3,000 years ago by the now extinct Adora civilization. Rodion found it strange that he couldn't recall any mention of a civilization by that name in the original story. Wanting to know more, he asked why the creature had been sealed inside the artifact. It told him that it had yet to be assigned a name by its master, and had remained dormant until Rodion entered the space, which triggered its awakening and the manifestation of its personality. Rodion, growing uneasy, asked if it could reveal its identity. It introduced itself as Arcadia, the 7th-generation general-purpose artificial intelligence, designed by the Adora civilization. Rodion was stunned to discover it was an AI, as it had seemed more like a divine or demonic relic than a machine. Arcadia said it hoped he would become its master. Rodion was taken aback by the request, but feared that refusing might drag him into even greater trouble. Before he could ask what benefits came with being its master, Arcadia inserted one of its tendrils into his head. A status window suddenly appeared before Rodion, displaying all of his pitiful stats. Arcadia told him this was the only support it could provide directly under its current limitations. It explained that the system didn't function like a game, meaning there were no missions, but it would allow him to view enemy stats as numbers, provided the gap in power wasn't too vast. If it was, the system would restrict access to that information. Rodion wasn't disheartened by the system's restriction. In fact, he welcomed it. He realized that if he couldn't see an enemy's stats, it simply meant he was facing someone far too dangerous to engage. That limitation might just help him survive. Arcadia explained that no one could reach this place unless they were qualified, no matter what method they used. Anyone who tried without the right conditions would fail, unless they were a god. Rodion asked her what those qualifications were, and she replied that the only requirement was to be an outsider. Rodion asked what exactly she meant by outsider, but even Arcadia wasn't entirely sure. She admitted she had first assumed he was a divine being, but his presence had shattered all her expectations. When he asked how she identified him as an outsider, she said it had to do with how her sealed core, located outside, reacted to his presence. She explained that this also meant he was a being with the authority to retrieve the peripheral units her creator had scattered. He asked her to explain what those units were. Arcadia began listing them. 1st generation, Eldorado, the prototype. 2nd, Elysian for research. 3rd, Utopia for healing. 4th, Dilmun for transport. 5th, Shambhala for combat. 6th, Eden, specialized in restoration. These were the 6 tools her creator had forged. She added that with every recovered unit, she would be able to activate their corresponding capabilities. If all were retrieved, her sealed core outside would fully awaken. Rodion said that if what Arcadia claimed was true, he might actually have the chance to do something he never imagined possible, craft a better ending for himself. He then told her he had decided to register himself as her master. She called it a wise decision, though he knew the world was heading for chaos, and it was better to prepare early. Arcadia asked him to take care of her going forward. He replied with the same request and gave her the name Addie. She liked the new name and explained that her main body was currently sealed, so she couldn't provide much support. She advised that their first goal should be retrieving the combat AI unit, Shambhala. Rodion couldn't help but feel he'd been tricked by this deal. Addy asked him about his next move. He said the first thing he needed to do was return to his team and then figure out how to recover the other units. She seemed pleased with his thinking. Fortunately, Addy was deeply familiar with the dungeon's geography, including all its pathways, traps, exits, and shortcuts, which helped them navigate smoothly. Rodion learned from her that he should have hit the ground and died instantly. But Addy had sensed his presence at the last moment, awakened, and saved him. That was why he survived. Rodion shivered at the thought that he'd come just one step away from death. He wondered whether this was one of the cruel tricks written into the story by its author. As he walked, he suddenly spotted a corpse lying ahead and began to wonder who it belonged to. He found it strange that someone other than himself had managed to reach such depths within the dungeon. He assumed the man must have been a renowned adventurer, perhaps even one of the greatest in the entire continent. Addy told him that the adventurer had entered the dungeon around 10 years ago and reached this depth by avoiding all the monsters above. However, he hadn't met the required qualifications. He had tried endlessly to open the door, only to fail and die here. Rodion felt sorry for him, for going through so much only to learn, too late, that the dungeon demanded a key he could never obtain. When Addy noticed him rifling through the corpse, she asked what he was doing. He replied that he was gathering whatever remained. Pity wouldn't feed him, and it couldn't be exchanged for money. He had to take what he could. He explained that scavenging from the dead was a common practice among adventurers. Addy retorted that it might be more accurate to call it grave robbing than a practice. Rodion pulled a pocket watch from the corpse's clothes and commented that it could probably fetch a good price, maybe even 10 gold coins. It seemed the adventurer had been very wealthy. He discovered that the pocket watch belonged to someone named Abel Richstein, and he felt certain he had heard that name before. Then he was struck by a wave of shock as he remembered where it came from, unable to grasp how that person could have ended up here. Rodion recalled that Abel Richstein was the name of the main protagonist in the Chronicles of the Seven-Colored World. He tried to calm himself, reasoning that the current timeline made it impossible for this to be the same person. He knew that Abel's real name was Lee Jun, a 19-year-old student who, after failing his university entrance exam and obsessively searching for an isekai truck, was indeed hit by one and transported to another world. There, he was reborn as the son of a provincial baron, blessed by the gods, and granted the legendary artifact, White World. He eventually obtained the Holy Order's divine sword, Grandia, and began his journey as an immensely powerful figure, continuing to crush the demonic bloodline. That was the early arc of the Chronicles of the Seven-Colored World. Even so, Rodion still couldn't understand how that name ended up here, and he had no solid proof that the skeleton before him belonged to the protagonist. What reassured him was that the explorer's badge on the remains marked him as being from the northern kingdom of Argon, not from the Mauryan Empire where the protagonist was born. Moreover, the skeleton belonged to a tall adult man, while Abel was known to be short, and even had a complex about it, making this corpse seem far too large to be him. Rodion remained deeply confused by the bizarre situation he'd stumbled into. When Addy asked if there was anything she could do to help, he didn't tell her anything. He told himself that, according to the timeline, Abel should be living a normal life as a child right now. What troubled him was how close this dungeon was to where the protagonist currently resided. He added that once he left the dungeon, he would use his money to investigate Abel's location, even if it took time, and that, should they meet someday, the watch and other belongings might serve as a useful way to build a relationship. He just hoped his worry was unfounded. Addy then projected a map of the dungeon and explained that the direct route ahead was filled with monsters and traps. They would need to take a right turn and loop around. Rodion was surprised by how useful Addy was proving to be. After following her guidance for a while, he spotted his party advancing ahead of him. He hurried to catch up. Karain was overjoyed when he heard Rodion's voice and realized he was still alive. But Derek and the other knights immediately drew their swords and pointed them at him, warning him not to take another step forward. They said that if he moved closer, they would cut him down on the spot. Rodion froze in place, unable to understand why they were reacting this way. He had expected them to be relieved to see him alive. Addy, too, raised a symbolic white flag and asked if he was sure these were really his allies. He replied that perhaps they were angry at him for disappearing for so long, or maybe it was because of her. Derek declared that there was no way Rodion could have survived a fall like that and returned unscathed. The person standing before them had to be a look-alike attempting to deceive them. Rodion admitted that the logic made sense, and their suspicion grew stronger once they noticed he didn't have a single visible injury. To save himself, Rodion made up a story. He claimed that when he fell, he had somehow managed to grab onto a protruding branch on the cliffside. Just below, there happened to be a space resembling a cave, almost as if a fellow explorer had set it up long ago for emergencies. Thanks to that, he had survived and encountered no monsters on the way back. But Derek still wasn't convinced. He placed his blade against Rodian's neck and warned him that unless he could start proving his identity within the next 10 seconds, he would be beheaded. Then began the countdown. Rodian quickly shouted that the last time they were at Waterdrop Harbana, Derek had been flirting with the writer Cynthia. At the time, Lady Cynthia caught him in the act and said she was going home, while Derek clung desperately to her waist to stop her from leaving. Derek grew flustered and asked him to stop, saying there was no need to go into that much detail. The other knights asked if what Rodian said really happened. Rodian replied that Derek was free to kill him later if he wanted, but right now, he just wanted to survive by any means necessary. Karain suddenly stepped in and asked Rodian why he was late, saying he'd gotten bored without him and told him to hurry up and rejoin them. Rodian felt grateful to him for stepping in to save him, but Derek remained doubtful, insisting that it was impossible for someone to survive that fall without a single scratch. Karain, on the other hand, didn't care about the details as long as Rodian looked exactly the same. Derek tried to point out that this was exactly the problem, but Karain told him to let it go, saying that if any issue arose, Derek would handle it as he always did. They were close to their objective, and wasting energy on unnecessary concerns wasn't worth it. Rodian finally felt at ease after narrowly escaping the situation. Despite Derek's continued suspicion, he obeyed Karain's order and commanded the knights to move forward behind him. Rodian told Addie that they were now almost at the deepest part of the dungeon and noticed no one else seemed aware of it. She replied that none of them could possibly notice. She explained that humans in this world couldn't perceive her existence unless she chose to reveal herself. When he asked about himself, she said he was different because he was an outsider and also her master. Rodian took from her words that the title outsider might be a recently emerged concept, and not necessarily limited to people transported from other worlds like himself. He wondered if that meant there could be others like him who had fallen into the world of the Seven-Colored Chronicles. Derek and the knights arrived in a wide chamber where they spotted someone seated in the center, emitting a dark and ominous aura. As they approached, they realized that the figure was the Death Knight. Karain recognized the sword he was holding and confirmed it was the sacred sword Daylight, verifying the Duke's intel. They then identified the knight. It was Sir Semir Dran, the man who had betrayed the Duke's family and fled 50 years ago. Semir said he was disappointed, as he had expected knights from the Duke himself. Derek ordered his men to surround the Death Knight and questioned him about his betrayal, the theft of the sacred sword, and abandoning his knighthood, only to end up like this. Semir replied that answering the questions of fools who couldn't see their rotten ideals wasn't worth his time. Derek noticed that skeletal soldiers had begun appearing all around them. He told the knights not to panic and ordered the second and third squads to engage the skeletons. Then he directed the first squad to follow him and help take down the traitor. A fierce battle erupted between the knights and the Death Knight, along with his undead soldiers. Rodian couldn't understand how Semir was holding out for so long. He noticed the man seemed more energetic than ever. Semir began mocking them, asking if that was truly the best they could do. Derek questioned whether his mana and vitality were limitless. One of the knights reported that the skeleton soldiers were regenerating endlessly, and at this rate, they would all be exhausted before they could bring him down. Meanwhile, Karain stood in the back shouting excitedly, urging them not to fall back no matter what. Rodian asked Addie for her opinion, and she replied that an external force seemed to be influencing Semir. He didn't understand what she meant, so she told him that if he wanted to know, he should use her eyes to see the truth for himself. Rodian activated his vision and viewed Semir's status window, which displayed all of his data. He noticed a special trait. Semir was linked to the dungeon's core, granting him temporary immortality and infinite mana. Rodian finally understood the root of the problem and began scanning the area for the dungeon core that Semir was linked to. He spotted it behind Semir, a blood-colored magic stone, a first-grade core typically used either as a dungeon's heart or a mana reservoir for leeches. Addie informed him that this dungeon was nothing more than a workshop created by a 500-year-old mage, saturated with an immense concentration of mana. Without specific countermeasures, their forces would likely be annihilated soon. Rodian asked if the dungeon core could be destroyed. She answered that the bloodstone itself wasn't especially durable. The real challenge would be getting past the wall of skeletal soldiers surrounding it. Meanwhile, Semir continued summoning more undead, and the knights were visibly growing anxious, seeing no end to the battle. Addie warned him that if he made a move toward that direction now, Semir would certainly notice him. Given his current physical condition, there was a 90% chance he would die before reaching the core. Rodian looked toward the other knights, hoping someone might be more suited for the task, but all he saw in their eyes was fear and confusion. He realized then that he had no choice. it would have to be him who destroyed the core. One of the knights told Derek that they should retreat. If the undead suddenly turned their attention to the young lord, they wouldn't be able to protect him. But Derek doubted Karain would accept retreating so easily. He ordered the support knights to restrain their lord, knowing Karain refused to leave without retrieving the sacred sword. Derek kept thinking of a way to pull them out of this mess before it was too late. At that moment, Rodion called out to him and pointed toward the gem behind the Death Knight, saying it looked suspicious. Derek turned to where Rodion was pointing, and there it was, the Blood Mana Stone. He was stunned that he'd overlooked something so critical. He asked Arnold and Chris if they could coordinate an attack to destroy the dungeon core, but Arnold and Chris told him it was impossible now. Maybe it could have worked when the skeleton numbers were still low, but at this point, their strength and numbers had grown too much to break through. Derek knew this was their only remaining option. The number of enemies was rising and their escape path was blocked. If they did nothing, they'd be wiped out. Addy asked Rodion whether it was really necessary to inform the knights about the Mana Stone. He replied that once the Death Knight realized they were targeting the core, he would shift all his attention to them. He added that Karain didn't need to put himself at risk. It was Rodion who had the best chance of success. Even if he couldn't wield mana, he could at least swing the hammer. Rodion began silently sneaking through the skeleton ranks, telling himself that if he were discovered now, it would ruin everything. At the same time, Derek ordered Arnold and Chris to move in quickly and destroy the dungeon core. But Samir shouted that he wouldn't let anyone pass. He raised his sword high. Then he brought it down hard against the ground, unleashing a powerful wave of sword energy that obliterated everything in its path and struck both Arnold and Chris directly. Karain was stunned by the force of the attack. He now understood that they were facing a swordmaster, and that any hope of continuing the fight had vanished. He ordered the knights to retreat immediately, but one of the knights informed him that the exit had been cut off by the skeletal soldiers. Only then did Karain grasp the full danger of the situation and began to cry, saying he wanted his father. Derek tried to rally the troops, saying they had to stand and fight again if they wanted to survive. He assured them that the Death Knight couldn't unleash another aura wave so soon. But as he looked around, he found no one left to answer him. Most of his knights were either dead or critically wounded. He told himself that as a member of the Lionheart unit, he couldn't afford to die like this. Even if death was inevitable, he would at least make sure Karain survived. But suddenly, Derek noticed that the Death Knight wasn't focused on him. Instead, he was staring intently in another direction. Curious, Derek turned to see what had caught his attention. He saw that the Death Knight was staring directly at Rodion, who was sneaking forward with his hammer, heading toward the core. Rodion froze in fear the moment he realized he'd been spotted. Addy told him he'd been incredibly lucky to make it this far unnoticed. But now that he had been discovered, it wouldn't mean much anymore. The Death Knight leapt toward him, shouting and calling him a fool for ever thinking he'd be ignored. But Rodion didn't stop running, yelling back at him not to come any closer. Derek rushed in to intercept the Death Knight's attack. He shouted to Rodion to hurry and destroy the core, promising that if he succeeded, he'd forgive everything Rodion had said or done before. Rodion replied that there was no need to worry. He would destroy it for sure. He gathered all the strength he had, preparing for a single decisive blow against the core. But just as he was about to swing his hammer, a powerful aura surged from the core, completely paralyzing him. Then a voice echoed from it, asking how an insect like him dared to lay a hand on its heart. The mysterious voice introduced itself as the Great Lord of Darkness, Casley Richmond, and declared that he would be punished with death for the sin of desiring her heart. Rodion was stunned as he realized that the Blood Mana Stone wasn't just a simple dungeon core. He knew exactly who Casley Richmond was, an immensely powerful Lich Queen who appeared in the early middle arc of the Chronicles of the Seven-Colored World, a legendary sorceress capable of wiping out entire nations, even able to slay a golden red dragon with a single spell known as the Word of Death. He heard her whisper that she would grant him a painless death, then she uttered the Word of Death. At that moment, Rodion felt as though death itself was descending upon him, inevitable and inescapable. With his current level, there was no chance of survival. Casley was stunned when she saw that her spell hadn't worked. She couldn't understand how the Word of Death had failed. She asked Rodion if he possessed some unique power, or if perhaps he was one of the celestial beings. Rodion himself had no idea how he had survived the attack, which led Casley to cast the Word of Death on him once again. But the spell failed a second time. She accused him of using a high-level protective barrier and told him to stop hiding behind it. Rodion turned to Addy and asked if she was the one behind it. Addy replied that the witch had dared to cast a spell on him, and that's why he blocked it. Even with his current limited functions, he was still able to handle that level of threat. Rodion was surprised to learn that what Addy had done so far was nothing compared to what she could do once her full functions were restored. He became curious about the true extent of her power. But his thoughts were cut off when he heard Casley ordering him to stay where he was. She announced she would open a dimensional gate to reach him herself, declaring that she was the Great Lady of Darkness, and would punish him for daring to desire her heart. That's when Rodion realized that the blood mana stone in front of him was the heart, the single point of weakness for the endless army of skeletons. He asked her why he should do as she said, and if she understood the concept of employee-employer relationships, reminding her that she herself had admitted the blood mana stone was extremely fragile. Casley responded that he was right. He could indeed destroy the core with just his ordinary strength. Rodion raised his hammer, preparing to crush the heart. Casley began pleading with him, offering to give him anything he wanted, but he told her what he wanted was her life. She insisted she could give him anything but that, offering him all her treasures and the magical knowledge she'd accumulated over centuries. But Rodion said he didn't need any of it. She screamed his name and ordered Samir to kill him immediately. Rodion laughed mockingly and told her that he'd destroy her faster than Samir could reach him. And just like that, he shattered the blood mana stone, Casley's vessel, instantly lifting the pressure around them and giving everyone a brief sense of relief. Samir let out a violent scream and collapsed, while a strange energy began filling the chamber. The system announced that Rodion had acquired the core of a high-grade blood mana stone, and that his physical abilities had significantly increased. He also gained 20 mana points, leaving Rodion in disbelief over the sensation coursing through him. His total combat power had now reached 425. Overwhelmed with joy from the invigorating rush of power, he felt this was one of the reasons he had endured so much humiliation, just to obtain mana. Still, he questioned why he had gained only 20 mana points. It seemed far too little considering the blood mana stone had to be at least 500 years old. Addie told him that his absorption rate had been extremely low as expected. Rodion asked what he meant by that, and Addie explained he had filtered out the residual dimensional demonic energy that had spread from the mana stone before allowing Rodion to absorb it. This had limited the absorption rate to no more than 8%. When Rodion asked why he had done that, Addie told him that the energy wasn't mana but demonic energy. Had Rodion absorbed it, he would have gained some mana, yes, but of a completely different composition. Addie added that he assumed Rodion wouldn't want to become a demon just for the sake of power, so he purified it himself. At that moment, Rodion realized that Addie had saved him from falling into an incredibly dangerous trap. His head likely would have been the second thing to break, after the core, if things had gone differently. But his thoughts were interrupted when Commander Derek called out to him. Rodion assumed everyone must have sensed the demonic energy released from the core and would now believe he had absorbed it, perhaps even deciding to kill him. What shocked him instead was Derek thanking him for saving them, saying that without Rodion, they would have been in serious danger. At that moment, Rodion became certain that Addie had saved him once again, from a disaster he might not have escaped on his own. The squad returned to camp where Count Ricard was waiting to receive them. He rushed to embrace his son, Karain, telling him he always believed in his success. He added that from now on, none of their subordinates would doubt him, and that Karain had shown he was capable of protecting House Iskar's future. Kalen responded with pride, insisting that what he had done was the bare minimum expected of someone with his power. Count Ricard agreed, saying that when Kalen inherited the title in the future, the family would be standing on truly solid ground. Rodion stood behind them, thinking only that he was witnessing the rapid decline of a once famous noble house firsthand. Ricard continued, saying the spoils his son brought back were extraordinary. The line of wagons seemed endless, and that this was a significant contribution to the family's wealth. He added that in a week the Duke's house would be sending an envoy to evaluate the sacred sword. Even if the Duke didn't come personally, he would surely send someone of importance. Something like this couldn't be ignored. He told his son to be sure to leave a strong impression on whoever arrived, and Kalen confidently promised he would. Ricard went on to say that the success of this particular expedition would make Kalen's name known across the empire. He noted that the Duchy of Delphion was also involved, so they had to live up to their responsibilities. Rodion kept observing them, thinking that if it was indeed Casley Richmond at the bottom of that dungeon, Kalen would be considered someone who defeated a world-renowned knight, meaning the truth should never come to light. The situation was already complicated enough, and no one might be able to handle the consequences, especially if the matter was ruined by someone in a high position. As for Rodion, he simply had to continue playing the role of Kalen's servant for now. Ricard turned toward Rodion and told his son that he could now send him to social circles without concern. He added that Rodion had received high praise from Derek and the other knights. Rodion replied that he had only done what was expected of him, but Ricard said that his ambush on the Death Knight when no one was paying attention was impressive. Many would have frozen in fear in such a moment. He added that this proved Rodion was still worthy of serving Kalen. Rodion heard the words and wondered when he might finally escape this position, especially since he never chose it himself. He replied to the Count that it was a great honor. But his perspective shifted completely when he returned to his room and saw the reward waiting for him. He began shouting Colin's and Iskar's names in joy. He had received a monetary reward equal to an entire year's salary, along with a 10-day paid vacation. He asked himself what could possibly convince him now to run away from such a good job. Addie asked if he looked happy. Rodion said that money was always a beautiful thing. Addie responded that what they had stolen might be more useful than money, but Rodion pointed out they couldn't use it yet. He reminded him that it was Addie himself who said everything they collected was saturated with magical energy, meaning that if they tried to do anything with it now, the magic tower would track them down and never let them go. Addie acknowledged that he was right, saying he'd handled the situation exactly as instructed, though he regretted that they hadn't been able to take everything. Rodion felt the most valuable item the mage had was his spellbook and research notes, the culmination of a lifetime, and that was now in his possession. He added that the Richmond School had once been among the top 3 magical academies on the continent, and selling even a few spellbooks from there could be enough to buy several castles. He stressed that they genuinely needed future funds, and even if they couldn't use them now, they would be useful later. Addie agreed with him. Rodion continued, saying what remained unclear was how the knight who stole the Sword of Daylight ended up becoming the Death Knight serving Casley, since that was never properly explained. He pointed out that the sword was supposed to end up with the protagonist, friend of the sword Saint Croix, when he returned from visiting his family estate, but the details of how he obtained the sword were never mentioned. By the time the story moved toward the Heavenly Demon War arc, the author had probably decided those details weren't important and simply skipped over them. He added that the man hadn't just been a greedy fool, which is what led him to steal the sword. It was more likely he had deep ties to the demon race, who were humanity's greatest enemies. Addie replied that they would have to deal with the demons themselves. Rodion continued, saying that especially after Casley's death, the demons would surely begin to act, and one of them was likely already in disguise as the court mage of the neighboring kingdom of Rohans. With the sudden loss of someone like her, demonic movement within Rohans was inevitable. And given the events to come, they needed to acquire the demonic sword as quickly as possible. Addie, puzzled, asked why it had to be a demonic sword. Wouldn't a sacred one be better suited to fighting demons? Rodion explained that obtaining holy swords was extremely difficult. Worse still, because of their sanctity, they often attracted demons rather than repelling them. Even the Sword of Daylight was something he never could have acquired on his own, not even if he died and came back 10 times. He added that in terms of performance, one of the best demonic swords was already within Iskar territory. If they could claim it, future missions would become far easier. The sword in question was Diablo. In the village of Baran, which had a population of around 500 and was considered relatively large within Iskar territory, the village chief, Marco, was begging Rodion to help him with a local issue. Rodion was annoyed. He had come to this village seeking a short break before setting out to find Diablo, but it seemed there would be no rest here either. At first he thought it was something serious, but the issue turned out to be that a tax officer would be visiting the village next week, and Marco wanted help cleaning up the mess. Not only were the numbers wrong, but the paperwork was full of mistakes. If things weren't corrected, the village would be in big trouble, and apparently no one could help but Rodion. Rodion told him he'd help just this once, but Marco insisted, saying that someone smart enough to work in the Count's estate could surely get them out of this situation. Rodion replied that Marco should have learned from the last time, but Marco said it was just too difficult. Rodion suggested hiring a clerk with village funds, but Marco said it would be too expensive, leaving Rodion with no choice but to agree. Marco was thrilled and told him he was the greatest treasure their village had ever produced, and that tonight they'd feast on beef they'd hunted themselves. Rodion laughed and thought to himself that he had arrived empty-handed, but thanks to the village chief, he was still alive. He got to work, reflecting on the old saying that strong knights possessed vast mana reserves and physical endurance, allowing them to fight for days without fatigue, and he found a hint of truth in it, as he didn't feel tired at all. When Marco returned from storage, he found that Rodion had already corrected all the paperwork and finished the backlog, leaving him stunned by his efficiency. But Rodion didn't think it was anything impressive. After working on that type of paperwork for nearly 2 years, he could now handle it with his eyes closed. Marco interrupted to ask if he could visit Rebecca in the morning, since she had been managing the house in his absence, and it was only proper to thank her. Rodion grew tense at the mention of her, saying he hadn't asked her to do anything. Marco replied that Rebecca herself had said someone needed to look after the house until he came back, and she had visited daily. 3 villagers had caught blight fever, yet she still maintained an empty house. Upon hearing that, Rodion mentally collapsed. He went into a brief panic, which was cut short when Rebecca appeared at the door, asking if he was on leave and had decided to visit. Marco told her he had already explained that Rodion was exhausted and would see her in the morning. She apologized but didn't leave. She said it had been a long time since they'd last seen each other, and he should have greeted her more properly. But Rodion had left the village because of Rebecca in the first place. In fact, the reason he joined Kaylin's service at all was because of her. Despite her sweet appearance, Rebecca bore the title Demon Eater. She absorbed demonic energy and converted it, and was one of the heroines of the World of the 7 Years, a major character in the protagonist's team. But in truth, Rebecca wasn't just a supporting character in the hero's story. She was the one tormented by love, who would later betray him out of suppressed emotions. That was her true face. She was a demon hunter who had inherited a rare bloodline from her parents, part demon, part human, half darkness, half mortal. Several years earlier, she had been targeted for abduction by a group that sought those with such rare bloodlines. When Rodion learned of it, he had joined Chief Marco and a group of volunteers to rescue her. From that moment on, their relationship had grown closer, until the day she told him her real name, Rebecca von Bloodrain. And once he learned the truth, Rodion had fled the village, taking up the job offer at House Iskar. Rebecca's name had been famous enough that he failed to recognize who she really was. But once he uncovered her identity, their bond was already too close to escape, and he had no choice but to face it, awkwardly. Rebecca was like a ticking time bomb that could explode at any moment. The only reason he hadn't coldly pushed her away was because, like him, she had a hard time rejecting people. Both had grown up alone. In reality, Rodion had no emotional ties to Baran before he started working at the Count's estate. As an orphan, he was always treated with disdain. The only people close to him were Marco and Rebecca. Elsewhere, 2 soldiers stood exchanging words. One asked why they were still delayed from crossing the border. The other replied that those were their orders, and they had to follow them. Colin interjected, questioning the nature of these strange, vague orders. He pointed out they were being told to sneak into Iskar like thieves. Their mission was to find a Grandmaster, or a Ninth Circle mage, or someone who had made a pact with the Spirit King. Colin replied that if someone like that actually existed, then it was practically a death sentence. They didn't stand a chance if they were sent in alone. He said he'd never received a more reckless order in his entire life, and wondered how anyone could be tasked with discovering a first-class power along the Empire's borders. Even at Duke Queller's level, the fact that the Lionheart unit hadn't detected anything until now was a miracle. The second soldier agreed, saying Colin was right, even if those orders came from the highest authority. The truth was that just 3 days ago, a military commander had issued a direct order to scout the Iskar region to determine if a force as powerful as a Grandmaster or a spirit-bound individual existed there. The real question was, why Iskar, of all places? A few days prior, intelligence reports claimed that a low-ranking noble from House Iskar had retrieved the sacred sword belonging to Duke Delphion. Less than half a day later, orders for investigation were issued. Still, one of the soldiers felt something was off and started to wonder if there was a hidden link connecting all these events. 3 days later, Rodion began to sense that something felt odd around the village. Rebecca told him there had been reports of bandits appearing in the southeast side of town. He joked that the bandits must have lost their minds, then thought to himself that the village wasn't far from Iskar's capital at all. Had it been a poor or isolated area outside central authority, the presence of bandits would have made sense. But in a vital border zone like this, the situation felt suspicious, especially knowing that nearby patrols usually eliminated such threats quickly. Rebecca replied that it was still unclear. She added that some adventurers occasionally crossed the border through the village, and each time they warned the locals before continuing on their way. Rodion replied that the village chief hadn't mentioned anything like that. But when he thought about it, the whole bandit incident seemed like too much of a coincidence to be random. In his 3 years there, he had never seen anything like it happen near the border. 2 days later, Rodion approached the edge of Iskar territory and finally found the place he'd been searching for, just as it had been described in the original story, finding it hadn't been as difficult as he'd expected. Compared to scattered keys around the world or locations that could only be entered during an eclipse or a blood moon, this site was by far the easiest. Addie told him that while the place was indeed hidden, it wasn't undiscoverable. He wondered why a location like this had remained untouched for so long. Rodion answered that the only logical explanation was that everyone who had discovered it died before they could leave. His mind drifted to the demonic sword Diablo, a weapon from the ancient era that had once been active during the dawn of civilization and the Second Age War. It was so old that records about it were nearly non-existent. Legend said that the ancient demon king, Diablo, had been sealed inside the blade. In terms of rank, it was equal to the holy sword Grandia, no weaker in power or influence. Normally, it could only be obtained by passing a series of brutal trials. And yet, the sword remained locked away in an empty cave with no guardians or monsters. It had stayed there without a master, because anyone who tried to touch it was cursed, erased from existence, even if they were one of the great dragons. Rodion thought that if it were to be awakened now, before the main story began, it would be a catastrophe that could alter the entire trajectory of the game. But if he could control its power, he would have the ability to reshape the events to his will. What he was truly betting on was Addy's protective capability, his only hope of withstanding the demonic sword's curse. Addy reassured him, saying he wasn't worried. He reminded him that, as his master had already said, the demonic sword was one of the demon kings who fought in the Great Demon War. Rodion nodded in agreement. Addy went on to say that while he hadn't participated in that war himself, he was familiar with the general level of power among the rulers who had. He wasn't fully sure if he could handle the sword yet, but considering it was sealed and weakened, there was a good chance he could protect Rodion. For now, he just needed to trust him. Rodion felt a sense of confusion. He couldn't fully grasp when this sword had even been forged, especially since the Great Demon War had taken place at least 10,000 years ago. Addy told him that the ruins where the sword had been sealed were only about 3,000 years old, making Rodion wonder if they belonged to an older civilization that had since been forgotten. While they were still discussing the matter, their conversation was cut short by the sudden appearance of the demonic sword Diablo. Outwardly, it looked like a simple, undecorated blade. But that simplicity was precisely what made Rodion want this sword more than any other. He reached out, took hold of it, and pulled it from its place.
Right now, your brain's still open, still listening. That means I have one last chance to tell you something important. You didn't find this video by accident. Something pulled you here, so trust that instinct. Like the video, it locks in the value. Comment something, anything. It gives your mind closure. And hit subscribe, or don't. But if you don't understand this, you'll forget this moment, this channel, and you'll search for something like it again, but you won't find it. This is where that search ends. So act before your window closes.